everyone, and thank you for joining the 60-minute webinar on combating supply chain attacks. My name is Mandana White, and I'm the CEO of Smart Grid Forums, and I'll be your host for today. Now, before we get started with the program, I'd just like to run through a few administrative details with you to ensure the smooth running of the webinar for you. First of all, just to let you know that if you're an audience member, you won't be seen or heard by other audience members at all. The only way to be able to communicate more widely is through the chat panel on the right-hand side there. So feel free to go ahead and post any informal questions or any technical issues that you're experiencing there, and we'll keep an eye on that and help you out with that. Additionally, there's the Q&A link, which is the link at the bottom of your screen there. Please use that to post your questions for the speakers, and do that as you go, as they occur to you, and feel free also to upvote any questions that you'd like to see prioritized. Now, when you post a question, I'd really appreciate it if you could put the speaker's name that the question is for at the beginning of the question so that we can pose it to the appropriate speaker when the time comes. A reminder about the program: we have 3 10-minute presentations running back to back, and then we'll be taking questions for all 3 speakers for about 20 minutes afterwards. Once the webinar is complete, we'll be sending you an email with a link to download all the PowerPoint presentations from the speakers, and also to answer a few questions to help us continually improve the quality of our programs for you. So thank you very much for joining today. Delighted to have you all here. And now I'm going to invite up to the screen our first speaker, who is Pedro. Hello. Fernandes. Hi, Pedro. And Pedro is a senior manager for Industry X and OT security at Accenture. Pedro has kindly agreed to speak about developing a framework to effectively enforce end-to-end supply chain cybersecurity within the power grid environment. And just a few words about Pedro's background. Pedro is a senior manager in Accenture Security, leading Industry X and OT security projects in the renewables, utilities, energy, and related sectors. And with 15 or more years of security experience, Pedro has built OT security programs for operators, system integrators, and vendors in 4 continents. Pedro is also the co-author of several smart grid-related books and white papers, and an expert member of the IEC National Committee TC65 Working Group 10, and information member of the ISA 99 Working Group 9 TG7. So with that, Pedro, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Handing over to you, please go ahead and share your screen with the audience, and I'll just be in the background here to assist when required.
Thank you so much, Mandana, and thank you everyone for joining today's session. Well, the challenge that I was invited to was to talk a little bit about supply chain security from a standards perspective. So really how to build a risk management framework using the international standards that are well known by everybody. As you know, supply chain security is a hot topic lately, not only because of the attacks we have been suffering, but also because more and more we're interconnected through partners, suppliers, etc. I am with Accenture. I will not talk about Accenture. I hope you all know a little bit about the company, but please ping me offline if you want to know more about the OT services that we have, OT security services that we have for you. Now, so what is supply chain? I think that supply chain is a chain no more, right? So traditionally, we have been looking at the supply chain from the components providers that provide components to system integrators who integrate those systems into even larger systems of systems, distribute through logistics and through retailing until end users, right? And in this case, end users are utilities, for example. Now, with the digital transformation that we're going through, that is not true anymore. So we have cloud providers offering storage, advanced analytics, we have outsourced IT, we have outsourced SOC security services, like, for example, outsource SOC services. We even have outsourced legal and outsourced accounting. So all this mesh of not only product providers, but also services providers create an ecosystem of interconnected mesh, right? And they all talk to each other. Just for example, your outsourced IT is talking with your outsourced cloud provider, which in turn is talking to your outsourced SOC services provider. So with that, we all know that in security, you're as strong as the weakest link. And that can be no more true than in supply chain, because we are in this chain of interconnected mesh, right? So the example that I put here is a hacker that manages to get some malware to, for example, an accounting firm with an accounting software who sells accounting software for many utilities, for example. That accounting service has access to, for example, the CRM, and it has access to critical data. This happened with the NotPetya attack, and it was one of the most destructive attacks ever. So, not critical suppliers can be the stepping stone to critical assets. So that's one aspect of it, and the other aspect is that in the supply chain, you might not be the end link. So you have supply chain requirements for your suppliers, but your customers will have supply chain requirements for you. So you're just a link in between all this chain and ecosystem. So if we want to build a risk management framework for your supply chain, I typically summarize it in five pillars, right? So the strategy and plan pillar, where you define your strategy, you define your risk appetite, you identify your suppliers, critical and uncritical, etc. Then you build your standards, where you specify your objectives, what you want to achieve, what kind of risks you want to mitigate and mitigate, defer, etc. You assign roles and responsibilities, you assign budgets, and then you go into a loop of assessing, validation, and monitoring your supply chain risks, right? In the very bottom, you have the security technology, which can be blockchain security, for example, threat intelligence services that are now very talked about in the supply chain security. Now, as we said, the supply chain has evolved, right? Security needs to evolve too. So if we look at traditional standards like the 62443, the ISO, they look at the asset life cycle to define supply chain security. They go from specification to design, to implementation to operation, etc. But what about cloud providers, telecom providers, outsourced operations and outsourced maintenance, outsourced decommissioning of your assets? More and more people are outsourcing services, and this is part of our supply chain ecosystem. People used to have a list of requirements for their suppliers, but what about going into a risk-based profiling of suppliers and classifying them by criticality? Seeing if we have redundancy of suppliers, see if we can replace suppliers, see if we have contractual strength to have more and more requirements. All these goes from asset-centric to services and products supplier-centric, and to requirement to risk-based centric framework, right? So looking now at the well-known standards, we have, as you know, the IEC 62443, the ISO 27001, and of course NERC-CIP. So if you read the 62443, there is a whole module, which is the -4-1, that goes into the secure product development lifecycle, which is really that how you manufacture products with security. But that is not enough. You have to complement that standard with -2-4, -3-3, and -4-2, -4-2 from the IEC too. Okay. So bear that in mind. If we go for the ISO 27001, you have the Annex 4, which is exactly supply chain security, system acquisition, development, maintenance. But again, that's very asset-centric. You have to complement that with the ISO 27001 Annex 15, which goes into more the supplier relationships in a more holistic way of supplying services and products. And again, if you go to the NERC CIP 13, you have the supply chain requirements, but that should be complemented with the NERC CIP 10, which goes into a more holistic approach. Actually, if we take a look at the NERC CIP standard, and here's a timeline for compliance with the NERC CIP standard, you need to be compliant with the CIP 13, the CIP 10, and the CIP 5 in order to have a supply chain risk management framework well established. So, having said this, what's new? I mean, there's a big hype nowadays about supply chain security. So there's a lot of regulations and standards coming up. So just this year, NIST has published two documents. One is the key practices for cyber supply chain risk management, which is the Interagency Report 8276, which basically tells you to break organizational silos and basically tells you that supply chain is about breaking silos of legal, risk, compliance, IT, security, etc. Just 2 months ago, it published the minimum standards for vendor verification of code. So what are the requirements that you should tell your software vendors to comply with in order to acquire their products? And finally, in next year, they're mandated by an executive order to publish more supply chain requirements and lessons learned from pilot programs that assess the validity of all these requirements. So that's for NIST. What about Europe? So in Europe, we have ENISA. ENISA published long ago, 5-6 years ago, supply chain integrity. And for more than 6 years, they didn't publish anything. But just in the last 6 months, they published the NIST Directive 2.0, which has a specific section on supply chain security. And they published, again, just a couple of months ago, the threat landscape, very useful for threat intelligence, threat landscape for supply chain attacks. So a lot of good materials out there that we can use to build our risk management framework for supply chain. And with that, I just wanted to thank you, and hopefully I didn't go too much over my 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pedro. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So we'll ask you to take your seat back in the audience, and then we'll bring you back up onto the screen at the end of all three presentations. Thank you very much. Okay, so to introduce Julian to you, Julian McMenamin is the Regional Director for UK and Ireland at Nozomi Networks, and Julian will be talking about how you can ensure high levels of security and privacy for remote supplier access to your IT and OT infrastructure. As a background, Julian is an experienced business development leader within the computer security and networking industry. But before joining Nozomi, he worked for industry leaders such as NetScout, Visible Thread, and Radware, amongst other organizations. So Julian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mandana, and wanted to focus a little bit today on looking at your power grids and power suppliers as part of probably the key part of your supply chain. You'll always come across some organizations that, for whatever reason, don't require power to do business, but I think for the majority of us, having a reliable power source is very key. Very briefly, a little bit about Nozomi Networks and why I'm talking about this topic. Nozomi Networks specialize in the identification and securing of infrastructure in what are known as OT networks, or operational technologies. This will differ from a data center environment where people are looking at routers, switches, and web servers, to where we specialize in looking at industrial equipment and IT vulnerabilities that affect them. Looking specifically at utilities and electrical utilities here, 5 of the top utilities worldwide use Nozomi Networks to secure their environments, and that's where I'm deriving most of this information from. To look at national electrical utilities, and people would say, if you're not familiar with the area, what might expose an electrical utility to something like a cyber threat? You may or may not be aware, but that as organizations progress and technology progresses, for example, some of you may already be using smart meters. These things are, of course, internet connected. But when you look at the actual infrastructure that supports electrical infrastructure and critical national infrastructure across countries, increasing parts of electrical infrastructure, substations, and power stations are increasingly becoming, first of all, network connected, and second of all, internet connected. And these, in many cases, can be as vulnerable to cyber attacks as things like a web server in a bank or an e-business company. The types of attacks that affect this equipment are, of course, very different and specifically targeted at these endpoints, but they are no less exposed and also have to be understood and secured in an appropriate way. When you're looking at your supply chain reliability, have you considered your power supplier? Do you have an SLA with your power supplier? And what would be the impact on your business if your power supply was affected or indeed taken out by a cyber attack? If we're looking at cyber attacks specifically on the energy infrastructure, you can look across the internet yourself and do your own research, but there's many organizations out there that have reported known cyber attacks on many organizations worldwide. And these are the items that are reported. In many cases, some of these that don't cause too much of an impact don't get reported on. But certainly from our end, energy utilities worldwide are becoming much more attuned to the risk exposure that they have with regards to cyber attacks. This is also being driven by manufacturers and suppliers to energy infrastructure providers as they produce new equipment. A lot of new equipment nowadays is becoming network connected and internet connected, which is also driving the problem. And again, looking at the most targeted industries across the board last year, this would be 2020 versus 2019. Of course, things like banks and insurance companies are top of the list. But if you see as highlighted, in 2020, energy utilities ranked number 3, and it's increasing steadily. There's an increasing number of both for-profit hackers, as well as in some cases nation-state actors that are targeting what they see as critical national infrastructure for cyber attack. What I'm talking about specifically here today is cyber attacks that are targeted at the actual operational infrastructure, as opposed to where people might be used to seeing cyber attacks go at a traditional computer or IT infrastructure. What can utilities do to improve? And more to the point, I think, as we go through this, have any of you out there had conversations with your utilities? Do you have any backup plan in the case where your utility goes down? If you're in a larger manufacturing environment, you presumably have some sort of generator equipment or UPS. If you're a smaller organization, you may be completely exposed. Common operational challenges, certainly scalability. You would hope that your electrical provider will have the scale to handle small amounts of incidents across their network without it necessarily affecting you. Looking at continuous monitoring across their organization to guarantee a quality of service delivery would be taken for granted. Looking at clocks and various, again, back to things like smart meters that can be open to attack, and make sure that these things are secured and locked down, and preferably not receiving traffic or information that they shouldn't be receiving. And of course, mitigating, as I've been discussing, specific operational technology cyber attacks that will target this type of equipment. And we have a continuation from this slide to the next one. Looking at conclusions, increasingly power grids and electrical providers are having to look at their environment, not just their traditional IT environment, but their operational technology and, as is become known, Internet of Things environment for vulnerabilities. As hackers and challengers are finding traditional IT environments more difficult to hack, they're looking for other ways to threaten or debilitate an organization, and the OT IoT environment is being targeted. These organizations tend to be very good at traditional availability and safety, but maybe haven't looked in depth at IT security. Systems, of course, have to operate 24/365. People see their electrical and power utilities as utility. Just that, when you flick the button or switch something on, you expect it to work. Industrial networks are probably not something that many of you have considered with regards to your supply chain continuity. Certainly in most places in Western Europe and the United States, we're all used to using electrical services without any issue at all. Again, looking at some considerations and questions. If you were hit by a power outage, what effect would it have on your business? Do you have any type of business SLA with your power utility that you may have with other suppliers? Depending on the type of business you have, do you have a contingency plan for power outage? And what can you do? I would certainly say that you have conversations with your suppliers and understand what they're doing to secure their environments. I'll be available for questions once we've finished the next session. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Julian. That's wonderful. So I'll ask you to take your seat back in the audience, and then we'll bring you back up for the Q&A. We have David Eisenrich and Catherine Rivera from the FBI. David and Catherine are going to be addressing the topic of working in partnership with law enforcement to establish a robust incident response, recovery and reporting framework to effectively contribute to the intelligence pool and support the attribution process. So now just a quick reminder of David and Catherine's background. David Eisenrich joined the FBI in 2001 and is currently assigned to the Mission Critical Engagement Unit Cyber Division at FBI HQ. SA Eisenrich is the primary cyber division liaison to the energy sector and has served in the San Francisco CA, Albuquerque NM, and Jackson MS FBI field offices. He's also worked in a variety of criminal and national security matters and joined the unit in May of 2020. And Catherine Rivera joined the FBI in 2009 and is currently assigned to the FBI Cyber Division's Critical Infrastructure Intelligence Unit out of FBI headquarters. She primarily addresses threats to the energy, oil, and natural gas and nuclear sectors. And prior to joining the Cyber Division, Catherine served at FBI HQ's Counterterrorism Division and the Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Las Vegas field offices, working violations ranging from counterterrorism to criminal investigations. So thank you for joining us. Delighted to have you both here. And I'm now going to share your presentation.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mandana, for having us and for all the hard work that you and your technical staff engaged in to get us here today on the screen. Very much.
No problem.
So I just want to develop some themes in the next 10 or 15 minutes along the lines of what Mandana spoke about, and of course some of the things that Pedro touched on and our other speaker at the Smart Grids Forum. The first is I really would like to take a few minutes and declutter and to some extent demystify what it's like working with law enforcement, specifically the FBI, but we, as everybody knows, are a intelligence and law enforcement agency with an international presence. So we work with all of the major organizations, obviously Interpol, other organizations, European police departments. We have what are called legal attachés, which are essentially a very fancy word for a liaison, law enforcement liaison, that cover over 100 countries. So it's not going to be fundamentally different, say, in Paris than it would be in New York. Two great cities, by the way. So the first thing, and I think it bears repeating because I don't know that the law enforcement community has done a great job recently of saying this, is that we treat victims like victims. I think that's really easy to get lost in the energy that's released when you have a cyber incident, which is moving very, very fast and very quickly and may have ramifications that are broadly outside the organization that is the victim of the incident. There's a lot of inward and outward focus at that moment. I want to reassure everybody that the FBI treats victims like victims. We know you did not choose to be the recipient of a malicious cyber attack, whether that's ransomware or which is the most common, or business email compromise or anything else, or your OT systems have been meddled with. And so we will treat you as victims. What does that translate to when you're working with the FBI? Well, first and foremost, I work with a lot of companies, and one of the major concerns they have is that you're going to shut everything down, us being the FBI. You're going to seize all of our servers and our boxes and our hardware, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We work entirely cooperatively with the victim. The second thing is, most of what the FBI is going to need to respond to an incident is very similar to what a commercial remediation service that you would hire. You may have one on contract, you may hire one afterwards to remediate the incident. Most of that is going to be very similar to what we're going to need and try to preserve for evidentiary purposes and for attribution purposes, so we can do our very best to try to find out who, what, when, and why. So we'll actually work cooperatively not only with the victim, but with the entity that you hire to try to make this right. So I'd encourage everybody to really think of this more as a partnership with law enforcement, because that is how we try and look at it and how we approach it. Working with us also may entail as we discover stuff, we're going to do our very best to share that with you. So we may be able to give you perspective as to why you were targeted, why you were selected, in a broader sense, not just, well, here's how they got in. This was the avenue of attack. This was how they translated from IT to OT or whatever. However, whatever form the attack took place, that's just so many possibilities. But we might be able to give you a broader perspective as to why you specifically were targeted. And the last thing, in terms of, I would say, a large benefit for all of us in terms of working with law enforcement is our mission is to impose risk and consequences on the enemy. How does that, what does that translate to? And why is that important for, I think, for the private sector, for all of us, quite frankly, since government is often a target of cyber actors as well, right? Here's what it boils down to. If we can share intelligence and we can get it out there as quickly as possible, and in a moment, we'll look at some formal mechanisms that we have to share intelligence, and then we'll talk about informal, which is where a great deal of intelligence gets shared. We can maybe get ahead of the threat and maybe stop the attack where it happens, right? As opposed to always playing catch up. And so by reporting, by working with law enforcement, that's the place we need to get to. You think about it in these terms. Look at it as a graph, and whatever you want, but cyber incidents are going like this, and that's not going to change. That's the new reality. If anything, it's going to get worse because of the fee-for-service concept, right? Where you can literally go on the dark web or wherever else you choose to do that, and either pay for malware that would make you capable of having an attack, or have a profit-sharing arrangement with the owner of the malware. So we'll do the attack and we'll give you 25% of the ransom. That means that this is taking it out of the realm of the incredibly technical, incredibly intelligent, and putting it in the realm of the incredibly average. And that's a trend that's coming. It's coming fast. Add in artificial intelligence with that, and the capabilities that that's going to allow cyber attack actors to engage in, and you see why we have to get ahead of this threat, why we have to have a whole of government industry approach to this. So I really encourage everybody to think of this as a partnership, because I promise you that is how we approach it. To maximize our ability to get ahead of the threat and be helpful, lessons learned, it really helps to have a relationship before the event. There's probably no worse time trying to coordinate and put everything together than during the midst of a crisis. That's probably true for most aspects in life. It's certainly true for something like cyber, which is both complex and complicated. And just as extra layers of figuring out who you need to contact, who you can trust, who you can talk to, how they go about business, that makes it, I think, a little bit more difficult. One example, and this was not a cyber attack that I'm thinking of, places, names, Accenture removed, is we were working on a project with a multinational corporation to try to share intelligence and get ahead of the threat. And this corporation, obviously, part of it was based outside the US, part of it was based in the US. And what would seem like a very simple information exchange, because of different international laws, required corporate counsel from the non-United States facing portion of the corporation and the US facing portion of the corporation. What should have taken literally moments to complete took weeks. We had the luxury of that because we were forming an existing relationship. We will not have the luxury of that during a cyber incident, during a cyber attack. So this is actually a sheet, and Mandana will make this available for anyone who wants it. Just sort of an overview of working with the FBI that talks about some of the things that I mentioned and tries to set the stage for what it would be like. So I mentioned earlier informal and formal methods of information sharing. This is an FBI flash. This goes out, it's unclassified. This goes out to all recipients who are interested, and it is literally based on information that is reported to us, which we share with our other government partners and industry partners to put together that flash, that information sharing aspect, which we then send out. If we go to the next slide, you'll see another example, a PIN, industry notification, right? The same thing. It has indicators of compromise, what you can do, things to look for. All of that intelligence that we share through this formal mechanism would not be possible without a partnership with private industry. Somebody somewhere reported so that we could take that and share that with everybody and help folks make changes in advance that make it a harder target to attack you. None of that's possible without reporting, without that partnership. So this is, again, for the technical folks in the audience, this is a victim engagement checklist, incident response checklist. If you take a look at that, it's all going to look very, very familiar. I'm not going to go into it because I don't want anybody's eyes to glaze over, but if we just go to here and look at the next portion of it, it's what we're going to need. It's all very routine. There's nothing in there that should give anybody a hiccup. It's very similar to what you would expect. That this is what we'd ask you to be prepared for, and what we would need to move the ball forward. Nowhere in there does it say that we're going to critique your network or how you set things up. That's not what we're there for. We're there for investigation, incident response, to impose risk and consequences on the bad actors. Not to tell you if you set it up the right way or the wrong way. We'll never. That's not a lane we go down. We are not a regulatory agency. We're a law enforcement agency. So we're not going to say, well, you routed it through this VPN or you did this, that wasn't right. That is not what we're there for at all. Back to the first thing I started with, we treat victims like victims. And that's why that sheet doesn't say engagement checklist. It says victim engagement checklist. So this is the second part of it. Again, very, very, it's familiar to everybody that works this. And again, Mandana will make all of this available. So I mentioned earlier legal. I can't tell you how important, quite frankly, I think Pedro mentioned this earlier, it is that to make sure that the IT, OT folks are in sync with their corporate counsel or the law firm that they hire if you outsource this. During a cyber incident, obviously the first call is going to be to your IT, OT folks. Almost every incident I've ever responded to, the second call is right to your legal team. And they really do need to be part of the framework of that partnership so that they're comfortable working with law enforcement, working with your remediation company that will help get everything back running and getting you back in business. So please do have a relationship with them. Actually, at the FBI, we have something called the CISO Academy, which is, we're not that imaginative here, so it's exactly what it sounds like, right? We bring CISOs in from various companies, and a lot of times we'll actually ask them to bring their general counsel with them as part of that learning experience and sharing experience so they can understand what's going to happen as well and build those bridges. So I think it's absolutely essential to being in a position to respond best when a cyber incident happens, which is the goal. And so I asked Catherine to join us here today because she is a tactical intelligence analyst. We have multiple different types in the FBI. And so I wanted her to walk through when reporting comes in, just to sort of demystify this and understand how critical it is that we get reporting. What happens when reporting comes into the FBI? What do we do with it? And how does it get from there back to entities, companies, government that can use it, and those formal mechanisms as well, the PIN and flash that we showed in a moment. Catherine, if you wouldn't mind walking us through some of that.
Yeah, of course. So we have very robust intelligence capabilities here in Cyber Division. Each unit, even the one I'm a part of, Critical Infrastructure Intelligence Unit, we have at least 3 analysts in each one. Actually, more than 3 are devoted to threats in each specific sector. So what we do when we do receive reporting from private entities is they're exploited by us. We can take apart, like, what happened here? Who was the attacker? What do you have that would help us identify this individual? We run that through our systems. If necessary, we reach out to our OGA partners, other government agencies, other law enforcement, local, state, tribal, whoever it is we need to contact. And we get that all put together, and then we manage to pass that on to other FBI units that also work similar, not the same, but close enough threats. We exploit that, and when possible, we refer that to FBI field offices, either for case openings, investigations. We have robust liaisons with international law enforcement, including UK's law enforcement, and we use that to either determine methodology, get a positive outcome, either we help you recover monetary-wise, data-wise, anything we can. And then we, when possible, we are able to give that information back to the private sector in the form of pins and flashes. So that's what happens when you report. Like, we at least take that, we try to make some sort of case about it, make sure we can identify the bad actor, and then give back to you guys in the form of information so that you can identify what happened and then predict any incoming cyber attacks if they were to happen.
Yeah, and I think that last part is absolutely critical. In my mind, the best cyber attack is the one that never happens. And so if we can get that information and we can get ahead of the threat and we can take these networks down before they ever threaten systems, that's a win. That is the way that we're going to beat this in the future. Being in a responsive mode constantly it's difficult. It's stressful for private sector entities as well as government entities that are targeted. It's also tremendously expensive. An ounce of prevention is worth several $100 million of cure, right? So really that is the goal that we need to get to, and sometimes you might think, well, we're too small an entity or we're too large an entity, and this doesn't matter. You never know. That might be this little part of the jigsaw puzzle that we then put together, that we can figure out where this is coming from, where this network works, how to break this key, how to get in, how to do what we need to do to try to take it down before you ever have to deal with it on the receiving end of the malicious action. And that is where we need to move to in the future. Thank you so much, Catherine, for walking us through that. So these are three entities, the 24/7 CyberWatch that one can report to. There's also the IC3, and then I would also say that FBI field offices. And here in the States, there are 56 FBI offices with numerous smaller satellites, and then obviously reporting to law enforcement in other countries that we have relationships with. We'll undoubtedly work closely with them and acquire that. And so I feel like I've stressed it well enough, but I would really ask folks to consider reporting. It is moving the needle forward, and the threat that is most damaging is the one that we don't know about, that we then have to scramble to try to figure out, okay, what's this new thing on the horizon? Okay, so I think we'll just, I think, Mandana, you said that we might have some questions, and we're happy to take any of those.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, David. Thank you, Catherine. That's really good overview. That's a great, really helpful overview of the role that the FBI plays, where your priorities and focus is right now, and how you wish to partner with organizations. I think, David, you made a really good point that as crime as a service has become more prolific, as it's more available on the dark web and so on, the number of incidents is just going through the roof. It's becoming so much easier for people of low skill, in terms of hacking, to actually access services that will enable them to deliver exploits of quite a high level of sophistication. So with that in mind, have you seen over the past year an increase in terms of incidents and reporting during this COVID and lockdown period?
So there's actually, it's a great question, Mandana. There's actually IC3 data, so the Internet Crime Complaint Center, and that has shown a tremendous increase. as well as multiple private entities that remediation firms that we work with that have very good data as well to collect on incidents, and they've shown a tremendous increase. And I think it's very safe to say I can't see the future, but the trend is firmly leaning in that direction. And another thing that I think that is a challenging trend that I think may exacerbate that is this sort of blurring of the lines between nation-state actors and the cyber criminal actors. And while the end goals may be different, there seems to be a fair amount of moonlighting that goes on. And at best, best case scenario, there's sort of a tacit, we'll leave you alone. On the other end of the spectrum, a future concern is, we'll work with you, right? Let's make a little extra income. And that is a very, very dangerous trend that, to what you said, putting those high skill tools in the hands of folks that know just enough to put you in a position where you see on your screen, you're the victim of ransomware or whatever. Right. And this is how much we want. Yeah. And I know that nobody harbors any illusions on this, but there's no Robin Hood aspect here in the classical sense of any particular entities are off limits. I was looking the other night at an entity that does just research. They're not for profit on ways to energy efficiency and the future of energy and things that everyone will benefit from. And they were attacked. And I can, hospitals, we talked about NotPetya, right? So there nothing is off limits. No. It is a business for these people.
Yeah, that's right. And so, we've got the three categories. We've got those who are criminals looking for return on investment. We've got the nation state actors who have kind of geopolitical motivations, but then just the average hooligan as well, who's now off the street and in the digital space, behaving in exactly the same way as vandals, as disruptors, just to make a point, just to be disruptive, just to undo the good work of good organizations. And I'm sure those are going to be on the rise as well as we see crime as a service become more and more available. So in terms of rules of attribution, David and Catherine, in the physical world, the rules are quite clear and we have high levels of visibility as to what's going on and we can collect evidence very easily. In the digital world, that's the real challenge. The forensics can sometimes be mopped up before they're even discovered. So how does that affect attribution and what's the FBI working towards in terms of alternative rules for attribution in the digital space?
That's such a great question. So I say you've really hit the nail on the head. For where we are now and moving forward, attribution is going to be, it is exceedingly difficult. It is becoming more and more difficult all the time. And while new tools and techniques, many of which, unfortunately, I can't really talk about on this unclassified forum, are coming online, that's not alleviating the challenge that it's going to be. So I would say in terms of, obviously, forensics being forensics, that part remains, right? But what I would say is as soon as possible, right? Like as soon as you think something may be going on, you're monitoring your outward traffic and you see something odd, you need to reach out to, if not report it to law enforcement, at least the private entity that you have on contract or that you trust to at least take a look, or your own network. If if it's a larger corporation and they have folks that can do that. I'm thinking of some smaller to mid-sized ones that just don't have that in-house because. I'm trying not to get technical, but a shell can be dropped and can be gone before anybody knows it, right? And many, many other things can happen. And so, as soon as this isn't sort of it's so different than many other types of crime where, you know what, I'll just cross the street and hope to avoid it. There's no crossing the street here, right? So as soon as you have an inkling that something may not be right, take it to the next step, like do your due diligence.
Right.
And attribution is just going to become more and more difficult. Law enforcement will always get more techniques and tools to try to, but with the blurring of the lines with nation state and private, with the fee for service, with all of these things, it's just going to be the challenge of the years moving ahead. There's no way around that.
Yeah, and that's really the key. I think if utilities felt that there were alternative rules for attribution within the digital space, they would report more readily, because it would be worth putting their reputation at risk in order to get the result. The result would be almost more guaranteed if they knew that we could work around those back forensics and challenges around attribution. Okay, that's great to know. And finally, you mentioned that obviously you touched on the FBI's international interests. More and more cybercrime is carried out in a borderless manner. So there'll be bad actors in different territories working together. So what's your role in that scenario? How are you working with other law enforcement agencies around the world? And how can perhaps an organization in the UK or in France or Germany reach out to the FBI for your support and expertise in tackling a potential attack?
So that's a great question, and I'll kind of differentiate two main areas. So the first is a law enforcement action. Quite frankly, those are rare. In the U.S., our judicial process, we would get something called an indictment, which is basically a court-supported finding based upon evidence that a crime took place, and then we could actually indict folks, even if they're not in the U.S. They might be someplace else. Going back to NotPetya that Pedro mentioned, most of those activities took place multiple years ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago. Remember, we just handed down indictments. We indicted multiple individuals from the GRU on that particular action very recently. And so those actions are rare, and one might think that they don't have a massive effect because, well, those people are never going to leave their country, but it actually really does affect them. Because if you think about it, they're people just like anybody else, right? At some point, they may want to work in the private sector. That's closed to them, right? They may want to travel and go to a vacation in a country where we have mutual legal assistance treaties. That's closed to them, right? So there are consequences, even if they're not physically present, to putting forth a law enforcement action. On the other side, we work very closely with our international partners. Obviously, there's a special relationship with the UK being a Five Eye partner, but across the world, we work very closely with our law enforcement partners to try to attribute and impose risk and consequences on these bad actors wherever they are. And I think if there's a positive side to the unfortunately the rise in malicious cyber activity, it is the fact that the international community has recognized that this is a problem and that we do need to work together to combat that. That is, I think, the positive side of the equation. Not only is it it has to be a whole of government effort, meaning not just law enforcement industry, government. I think it has to be an effort where all of us work together, and that recognition clearly is there. And so there's no hesitation on the part of our partners, whether in Germany or the UK or Australia or a number of different places. For us to reach out, for them to reach out to us. We actually have specially trained, designated cyber attachés in major cyber activity hubs with friendly countries that will work directly with the law enforcement agency within that country on that specific threat. So that, I think, is a ray of sunshine that is coming through the clouds.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time and input into this webinar. It's been really valuable. It'll answer a lot of questions on our audience's lips right now. And of course, if they have any further questions, would it be okay for people to contact you to have their specific questions answered?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having us, Mandana. And we really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Mandana. It's my typing skills weren't quite up to notch there, and thank you, Sergio. I was just in the process of replying to you. No, absolutely not. Industrial equipment is by no means inherently insecure, and you are correct. A lot of protocols used in industry are proprietary and built by the organizations or users themselves. The other point is that a lot of this equipment still today runs on SCADA, which isn't as well known as the usual suspects in the IT world, like Windows or Unix or Linux. However, all of these, or typically things like PLCs and large industrial controllers, all run operating systems, and these units can run other software and accept other traffic over and above what they were designed or required to use. And one of the key points in securing this type of infrastructure is the ability to identify what they are, what they require to run, what protocols are required for them to do their job, and restrict other access or other traffic for going to and from those devices. The other point I think I brought up during my presentation is that historically, a lot of industrial equipment was not either network or internet connected, but that's beginning to change as manufacturers release new equipment. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Julian. We have another question here from Saga, who asks, why is availability more important than integrity? Supply chain focus on product integrity. Who would like to take that question?
I can take a stab at that.
Well, thank you, Pedro.
I think it's an important topic. We normally say that in industrial control systems, everything starts with availability, like being the most important, and then we go into integrity, and then finally into confidentiality, as opposed to IT, which is just the reverse. But I do agree that sometimes it's better not to have systems available than to have integrity problems within the systems, because when you have integrity problems, it means you're running your operations with faulty equipment, faulty data, and that can bring, that can really jeopardize the whole physical process, right? Where if you don't have availability of the system or of the products, you simply don't have the process at all. So you have to stop operations. But it's much better to stop operations than to have catastrophes in the operations, or to have bad products in the end, or bad unsatisfied customers in the very end. So I do agree on availability being as important, or sometimes even more important than integrity. So that's one point. The other point is that you mentioned that supply chain is about integrity of the products. Well, the message that I wanted to put across in my presentation is that it's not only about products, it's also about services, right? And but again, integrity of those services and availability of those services are at the same level of importance. For example, if you have an outsourced IT or an outsourced SOC, it's better not to have them for an hour than them telling you incorrect information about a potential attack, for example.
We have another question here for Julian. It's from Pablo Jimenez Flores, who says, we see an increase in attacks on energy utilities, but in which environment of this company, IT or OT? And what's the motivation for the OT attacks? Is it primarily economic or political?
We're seeing both. And I've often heard hackers generally being referred to in line with car thieves, that they'll go along trying the door of every car in the car park until they find one open. As people's capabilities or organizational capabilities in locking down IT environments has improved, it's reduced the footprint where hackers can try to act. And this is one of the reasons that they're now looking at OT networks. And we're seeing both nation state actors who are doing this from a cyber warfare type of viewpoint, as well as for-profit hackers who are looking at an opportunity to drive a ransom type of attack against power utilities. In other words, this is what we can do, pay usually a Bitcoin ransom or we'll take you down. So we are seeing both.
That's great. And what do you think are the benefits and risks or disadvantages of simply spreading of already running security solutions from IT world to the OT world?
They tend not to work. It's a little bit different. So IT solutions are focused on, quite simply, IT hardware and software. So things like web servers, database servers, routers, switches, IT network equipment. When you move into the manufacturing and operational technology environments, the technologies are typically different enough that things don't necessarily work well one to the other. There are some exceptions. You can, of course, firewall traffic from an OT network to an IT network or the internet. There's certain security technologies are somewhat universal, but to operate properly in an OT environment, you do need OT specific solutions.
Okay, great. Julian, Pedro, do you have any questions for each other based on the presentations that you've been watching?
Well, I can do one. So, of course, Nozomi is one of the greatest and best hardware, software, and services providers for OT environments and to protect OT operations. So as a hardware and software provider, how do you make sure that you don't bring supply chain threats into your customers? And that you really have the integrity of your products and your software and your logistics and your services secured, so you're not an entry vector yourself to your customers worldwide?
A very, very good question. And of course, this is becoming more of an issue as we're getting customer demands to deliver cloud-based and virtualized type of solutions. When you are delivering your own hardware solution that you build yourself in your own factory, and you're looking at your own supply chain end to end and your delivery to the customer end to end, it's much easier to secure than supplying software that's going on to a customer's hypervisor that is being managed by a third party, and there's several suppliers in terms of hardware, software, and services around what's being deployed. We, of course, we at Nozomi comply to standards, ISO, and a number of others, and we bring in third-party organizations like your own to audit and make sure that what we're doing is up to standard. From an IT perspective, we drive a very locked down software kernel, our own solutions, to make sure that we keep things as close to a minimum as possible to run what we need to do and leave no headroom there for anybody to run anything nefarious on our hardware or software.
Yes, thank you, Julian.
Thank you for that question, Pedro. Julian, do you have one for Pedro?
Yeah, difficult question, Pedro, but what do you see coming next in terms of supply chain issues? And do you want to talk to any of the sort of non-IT related stuff that's happening in the UK at the moment with supply chains being hit for things like petrol provision in the UK?
Sorry, I missed your last sentence. Can you?
What do you see coming next in terms of supply chain threats? And do you maybe want to talk to some of the non-IT specific problems, for example, being faced here in the UK at the moment, with lorry drivers not being available to deliver fuel, for example?
That's a very visible and, and very sensitive supply chain problem, definitely. We are definitely seeing worldwide, not only in the UK, that hackers tend to attack their end targets through their supply chain rather than directly, because more and more critical infrastructures are becoming more and more secure and difficult to penetrate. But at the same time, they trust their partners, their business partners, their suppliers, their services suppliers almost blindly, right? So it's much easier, and the scale that you can attack, the scale of end customers that you can attack just by attacking one supplier, it's huge. The example that I was putting of the NotPetya, the most destructive malware ever, was done by just compromising one accounting firm that was selling to 400,000 utilities and IT companies. So definitely a trend going forward of attacking suppliers. What I see like the next big step in security, securing this, I think it has to do with blockchain security. So using the blockchain concept, which is nothing but using transparency in the transactions. So I have a software with a lot of modules from a lot of other vendors. Who are all those vendors? How do they put secure development lifecycle into their products? How they integrate into the end software? Who do they sell it to? Who owns the company? All those informations about each one of those software and hardware modules going into a blockchain technology, which tracks all that, just gives a transparency of a supply chain security that it doesn't exist today. So all that visibility with blockchain is, I think, one of the ways to go and next steps. Yeah.
And talking to basically the same point, Pedro, something that we've picked up on recently is that we're seeing increasing numbers of industrial solutions of all sorts, even things like inventory management systems, where new technology is coming to market with what might be described as a call home facility. So organizations are deploying systems, and for very good reason. The manufacturer has remote access into the equipment, but also the equipment can talk out to its maker to say, there's more inventory required, I require service, these sorts of things. And these can also be routes in for cyber attack unless they're properly controlled and locked down.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where solutions like Nozomi come into place by giving traffic visibility and connection visibility to all that. Not only connections inside, but connections outside to a command and control kind of an attack. Yes,
exactly.
Sure. Nozomi has a very good intelligence service that I think could be very well used for supply chain, for example. We need intelligence of the attacks that our business partners have been targeted with. If we have that intelligence in an automated way, like you provide to customers, that is just very, very valuable to customers.
And it's also key, I think, to share information. So we issue CVE notifications on new vulnerabilities that we pick up on industrial equipment. Some organizations mightn't be aware of this, but it is public information. And I think it's very important that this information gets shared across the community, and people realize that what they might view as non-IT or a piece of industrial equipment does require a cybersecurity look at it.
Absolutely. It's a very broad topic, supply chain. Anyone connecting to our company providing services can be a supply chain problem, impose that problem. So definitely, that's why it's such a hot topic and making a lot of concern in the industry.
Exactly.
We have one more question for you, Julian. Serge Bernard questions, in your presentation, you show some numbers for National Electric Utility. He's not familiar with this particular utility. Can you give a small background resume of this utility? Where is it located? Is it high voltage? What KV, etc.?
It's a national utility. They're a customer of ours, and I can't really give any detail on the organization, but this is not a small private organization. It's a national utility. It would be in megawatts, not kilovolts. It's a large deployment.
Okay, and I think
not a public reference, therefore I can't really discuss it.
Right, okay, no problem, Julian. What are your thoughts, Julian and Pedro, about where we stand currently on reporting, and what would encourage more utilities to be really open and transparent about this so that we can start making rapid progress in this area?
There's a couple of, I think, key points here. First of all, there are many organizations that suffer breaches, and unless that breach causes an effect or an outage of some sort, they're unaware that they've been breached. This often becomes over time a prelude to a breach. So first of all, where there's no incident, many organizations, if they don't have the correct monitoring measures in place, may not realize that they have been breached. Where there is a recognized incident, I think reporting is key. The other issue is around forensics. So it's fine being able to report the fact that we've had an issue, something's gone wrong, we've had a cyber incident here, but being able to do forensics around that attack, being able to find out where the attack came from and the characteristics of the attack, to give the enforcement organization some chance of tracking down as to who was responsible. It's none of these things are easy, but unless you have the mechanisms in place beforehand, it's typically impossible to pick up afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, Julian, I think the whole process from reconnaissance to final exploit can take sometimes months or years. So you can have hackers sat in your systems monitoring and watching, gathering intelligence before they actually deliver the exploit. What are your thoughts, Julian and Pedro, on how utilities can confidently report as early as possible in the absence of forensics?
Yeah. Well, I think that utilities many times are resistant to reporting because that can also damage their reputation, right? And they have to protect their business unless they're completely confident that they really were attacked and that is really necessary to be reported. Now, so I think the mechanisms to make it confidential, to protect the confidentiality of the attack of the utility name should be always present, so they can be more free and feel more free to disclose. at the same time that the mechanisms to make the reporting lines very fluent. So these two things. One is to protect the company's reputation, and the other one is to demand or to suggest that they report as early as possible. In supply chain, this is critical. If people don't report, if the companies that were attacked, the vendors, the manufacturers that were attacked, they don't tell their customers that they have a compromised software, they're doing a bad job to their customers, right? So reporting is as early as possible, as the mechanisms should be there, but I think also the reputation of the companies should be protected.
Definitely. I think the stigma that is currently attached to a cyber attack is a little bit overinflated, because if we continue down that line, then nobody's going to report and we're not going to make any progress. So actually, how can we shift from stigma to actually reporting equals enhanced reputation? Because it's the courage of utilities who are willing to step forward and actually contribute to the intelligence pool. Is there a way that we can shift the perspective, reframe it so that utilities are encouraged to come forward because it's a reputation enhancer?
Certainly, and one of the key differences between the operational technology environment and the traditional IT environment is that, of course, there's no user credentials involved. So it's not like an e-business company having a web environment hacked where there may be end user details, there may be customer details, there may be financial history or credit card numbers. It's not that type of cyber incident. So I don't really see why organizations should be as embarrassed. And unfortunately, as we move forward, I think this is the world that we're now moving towards. People are going to have to realize that they're going to be attacked. And it's a bit like having your house broken into. It's an unpleasant experience, but if you don't share the information and if you don't tell your local authorities, you're going to pervade an environment that's going to encourage the activity.
Absolutely. And in that case, when we're talking about a house being broken into, when the homeowner is open about it, then the whole of the neighborhood comes together and watches out. And that's what we need to start seeing. Yeah, so we need to see more collaboration, more transparency, more openness, and working together. But I will wrap up now and say thank you to everyone. Pedro, Julian, David, thank you so much for joining. Thanks to all of our participants as well in the audience. I hope it's been useful to you today. So thank you, guys. Have a really good day, and we'll see you again on the platform in a month for our next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye for now. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video insightful and enjoyable. We post new smart grid related videos every Friday at 12 CET. So please go ahead and subscribe and let colleagues in other departments and peers in other organizations know so that they can benefit too. We welcome your feedback. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them below. Thanks again and have a great day.